You know, it doesn't matter whether you've been doing OD for 30 days or for 30 years, or some of you watching this maybe even longer than that. The basic question is, where did OD come from? A lot of the stuff that we take for granted, like survey feedback and group dynamics and leaderless groups and all the stuff that we do, we just take for granted. But there was a time, I know it's hard to believe, when nobody knew about this stuff. So a great question is, where did it come from? Isaac Newton, when he was talking about science, said, you know, we are very little people standing on the shoulders of giants. I think that's where we are with OD today. Those of us doing this work today, in a sense, are very little people standing on the shoulders of giants. So I want to look with you today for just a little while on who are some of those giants that our work is based on. So here's a question. Who was the first OD consultant? The very first OD consultant? Well, I started thinking about this and I thought, you know, picture a group of Neanderthal people, ancient, prehistoric people, like out hunting the mastodon, and a bunch of people coming back, probably the men, a bunch of the guys, coming back into the cave after the mastodon hunt. And I can imagine one of them, like named Karg, let's say. Karg stands up around the campfire and he says, hey guys, you know what? There's got to be a better way to hunt these mastodons. You know, we lost a couple of guys out there today. Let's take a time out here and talk about this. Do you think we need different spears? Do you think maybe there's something about the teamwork and the way we're going about this? If you think about it, that was the very first socio-technical intervention in the field of OD. Now, fast forward to the Egyptians. You see, when the Nile River flooded every year, that's where the water came for all the crops. And then they had to put a dam to hold the water. Well, it meant that everybody had to have the same type of dam. If there was one weak spot all along the Nile, then the water would drain out and they'd lose their water. So there were these engineers who were consulting engineers. You'll see another famous one came along a lot later. And so the Egyptians had consultants who went around to ensure the quality of the various dams and the dikes that were being built. So in a sense, you could think of them as kind of consultants. Now actually, the very first recorded conversation, at least that I know of, that could be seen as an OD consultant speaking with a client is a conversation that's a story about Moses in the Bible talking to Jethro, his father-in-law. Moses is leading the people of Israel across the wilderness, and he stops off to visit with his father-in-law Jethro, and he's having a conversation with Jethro, and he says, man, I'm going to paraphrase here. He says, man, I'm burnt out. I'm wiped out. I can't take this anymore. I've got people coming to me over and over and over again. I'm swamped. I don't have time to even turn around. What should I do? Now, Jethro is like an expert consultant. Of course, they haven't discovered process consultation or group dynamics at that point. So Jethro says to him, here's what you do, Moses. Take your very best people and put them in charge of 1,000. Take your next best people and put them in charge of 100. And your next best people and put them in charge of 10. He creates the hierarchical organization, which of course we now know and love. As far as I know, that's like one of the first conversations between a consultant and a client. Now, the kings and queens in medieval times, they also had people that were, how can we say it? They were able and willing to speak truth to power, an expression we use now. Who is somebody that has the courage to speak truth to power? Think of the court jesters. You know, these were the guys that wore the funny hats, and I'm assuming they were all men, and we don't know, that wore the funny hats and the funny outfits, and they would sit around the king and his court, the queen and her court, and every time the king or the queen would do something that was stupid, the court jester would jump up and would find some way to playfully, hopefully, playfully show the king or the queen that what they were doing was really stupid. And the king and queen would never kill the jester. It was like, hopefully, they never kill the jester. So the jester kind of had permission to speak the tough truth to the leader. Think of that as an example of the first kind of executive coaching done during the Middle Ages. So think about us now as being branches on a tree. Call it the OD tree. There are these roots, these people that we're going to talk about just in a minute, who came up with the fundamental principles which became the trunk of the tree, the founders of OD, and now each of us is way out on the very end benefiting from the work of these founders, only sometimes not knowing where it came from. So I'm going to look at 8 people right now who played a very significant role in laying the groundwork for what we now practice as OD. The first person that we have to look at is Sigmund Freud. You know, he's a very misunderstood person, but you got to understand, he was the first person to postulate, to say that inside of us we have more things going on. We have different, like, characters, or that there's actually an internal conversation that occurs inside of us. And Freud talked about 3 characters. He talked about the superego, which is like the conscience that says what's right and wrong. We have the id, which is those inner urges, those more animal urges in his mind that drove us to do things. And then we have the ego, which lives between them, and that's the one that tries to make life happen in the real world. Freud was the one who said that we live life inside of 3 domains, where these 3 domains interact: the self, other people, and what he called life. That'll come back again in the form of transactional analysis. He's the one who said we have defense mechanisms. He's the one who really began to talk about the unconscious. Very first person to say, you know, there's something going on inside of us that we can't even think about that's moving us to do things. Now, a student of his, a colleague and student of his named Carl Jung, came out of Freudian training and said, you know what, I get that, but there's a lot more to this than just the sort of mechanistic concept that Freud had, the psychoanalytic approach. And Jung said, you know what, we have not just an unconscious in each of us individually, there is a collective unconscious. That is, that the human species has an unconscious that has myths in it, that has things in it that are deeper, archetypes, like the hero or the warrior or the goddess, these sort of fundamental archetypes that live inside of us as human beings. Jung is also the one who said we also have a shadow inside of us, the shadow being those parts of ourselves that we have not integrated, the things that we deny about ourselves. Like if we're angry but we don't want to be angry, we deny the anger is in us and we see it everywhere else. That's the shadow being projected out on other people. He's the one, Jung is the one who said, there's more to us than just our thinking. We are more than rational beings. Dreams, intuition, those kinds of things were extremely important to Carl Jung. He was actually one of the precursors of Gestalt psychology. So Freud and Jung came out of a kind of a psychoanalytic frame of reference, and they were talking about the human being and their intuition, their thoughts, their minds. B.F. Skinner comes along, and he takes Pavlov. Remember Pavlov and the Russian psychologist who rang the bell and was able to get his dogs to salivate? Came up with the notion of what's called operant conditioning, where the researcher can actually train the animals to salivate with just the ringing of a bell. B.F. Skinner comes along, and he applies Pavlov's principles to human beings. And he says that people, not just animals, but people also are in a sense, is what's called stimulus response. Something happens, there's a stimulus that comes at us, we respond. All this talk about the unconscious and intuition and all this stuff, he says, is a bunch of hooey. It's really fairly mechanical. It's a process of X happens and then Y happens. Now, motivation comes from this. Performance management, which is a subset of OD, comes from this, that says if you want something to happen, you need to reward it. What gets rewarded gets repeated. If you want to improve something, measure it. You know, these are principles that come out of B.F. Skinner's concept of operant conditioning. Now, there was a woman in this mix. So far, a lot of these people are American or European white men. But there was a woman named Mary Parker Follett who stands out. Not many people know about her, but she was one of the very first people to get interested in group theory. This is around the turn of the century. She was also the one who began to look at conflict resolution. She took conflict and saw it going on and named it as something to be concerned about. She was one of the very first people to take a look at empowerment, and one of the very first people to take the role of the leader in a group and begin to examine it, and got curious about what's the effect of the What's the impact that the leader's behavior will have on the group? This is something that will come back very powerfully in the next segment. Erik Erikson, very simple, significant contribution to the field of OD. It was Erikson who really came up with the notion that human beings go through fairly predictable stages of development through their lifetime. They go through infancy and the toddler stage and the school stage and middle age and late adult life, and that each one of those stages has certain kind of psychological qualities or agendas that are being worked on during that phase. So anything that we do today in OD that has a kind of a developmental concept, like even the notion that a group goes through, you know, forming, norming, storming, and performing, all those things can trace their roots back to Erikson, who was one of the first people to kind of name that. Then another one is Abraham Maslow. Probably everyone in here has heard of Maslow's triangle, his hierarchy of needs. Maslow was very interested in what motivates people. And he's the one who figured out that an unmet need continues to motivate, but that a met need does not motivate anymore. So at the bottom of his hierarchy, you have physical needs like shelter and food and so forth, and it works its way all the way up through to the very top, which is kind of personal development. But the interesting thing I want to share with you here is that Maslow had this concept of, as a psychologist, why are we always looking at sick people? Why are we always trying to learn about psychology from looking at people that are neurotic or that are having problems? What could we discover if we looked at well people? What a concept. Let's look at people that seem to have it together and figure out what we can learn from them. He called it Eupsychian therapy, or Eupsychian. He applied it to organizations. Eupsychian management. Let's see if we can figure out what kind of people seem to do really, really well. I think it's the precursor to appreciative inquiry. The next two people who are the most important contributors in most recent time would be Carl Rogers and Eric Berne. Let's talk about Carl Rogers first. You know, he looked at analytical psychology, like especially Freud, and then behavioral psychology, like Skinner. And he said, you know what, there's a third, it was called third force or humanistic psychology. He said, neither of those two really take the whole person and look at the whole person. Jung was kind of getting at that, but Rogers was the first one who came up with the notion that we need to look at human beings as whole characters. He figured out that in therapy, when a client is sitting with a therapist, that the quality of the relationship between the helper, between the therapist and the person was extremely important. That relationship was the highway or the vehicle which really, in many ways, determined the quality of the therapy that was happening. So he called it client-centered therapy. Up to then, a lot of the therapy had been based on the therapist, in a sense, gathering data from the client, getting information from the client, and the therapist figuring everything out, and then somehow trying to get the client to hear it or understand it or learn it. Rogers said, no, let's do therapy so that the person, the client, is the one who's getting the insights. Very, very interesting shift that's taken place. He's the first one to popularize the notion of self-esteem and actually personal growth. The whole personal growth movement, which has a very significant step toward OD, as we'll see in a minute, came from Rogers. But Eric Berne made a huge book. I know in the early 70s when I discovered this book, it was like my life changed. It was called I'm Okay, You're Okay. Maybe you've heard of it. It was about transactional analysis. Eric Berne was a therapist who said we need to give therapy away to the people. We need to give counseling, give the principles away, teach our clients the principles of psychology so that they can take care of themselves instead of it having only residing over here in the expert. He came up with this concept of life scripts, that we're all living out a kind of a life script that we inherited or we created when we were very young, and that everything that happens as we get older can be seen as a reflection of that life script. And he wanted to help people change their life script or change their story. He's the one who said that self-esteem and personal growth depend on how the person inside handles these three characters. We have living inside of us a parent, you have a critical parent and a nurturing parent, and a child, in a sense, in our tummy. what wants something. So we have the natural child and we have the adaptive child that's trying to please the parent. And then in between the two, we have this adult, actually, that lives in the mind, that's trying to make decisions about what to do between these two characters. Remember Freud, remember? Superego, the id, and the ego. Here's Eric Berne coming back now to Freud's basic theory, only making it very, very practical. Eric Berne said, let's give this away to the people. Let's teach them the principles, the parent, adult, child, and so forth. Berne was actually the originator of the term self-help. That's such a huge thing now. The sections in the bookstores, on the internet, the whole field of self-help can be traced back to Eric Berne, and I think also to Carl Rogers. These 8 people that I've just talked to you about came from the psychology side of things. Their contribution to the field of OD is right there for us to see if we look for it. Then the next group of people, what I call the 4 giants, the 4 really big heavy-duty people in OD, were taking these same kind of principles, only looking at organizations. But we had to understand that where OD came from had its roots in a very special linkage back through the field of psychology. Now let's take a look at the 4 giants. When we look at standing on the shoulders of giants, the roots or origins of OD, these next 4 people are the giants. They are the giants on whose shoulders we're standing without a doubt. Therefore, Frederick Taylor, Kurt Lewin, or Lewin as it was Americanized, Wilfred Bion and a couple of his students and colleagues, and then Douglas McGregor. Well, let's start with Frederick Taylor. 1915, his book called Scientific Management just took the world by storm. Right after the Civil War in America, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to occur. The factories were beginning to get bigger, and management and ownership was beginning to get more and more wealthy on the backs of the workers. And there was a huge gap that began to exist in these factories. The workers were seen to be slow and lazy and dumb and resistant, and management began to have problems, and that's where unions came from, frankly, out of that whole thing. Frederick Taylor was kind of born at that time and grew up experiencing this increasing gap between, in fact, there's a great quote in Marv Weisbord's book, by the way, which I'm going to urge you all to get at the end of this, where somebody from the union would say to a consultant, yeah, we have this very special arrangement going. The management pretends to pay us well, and we pretend to work. So Frederick Taylor comes into this and he says, you know what, let's get rational here, folks. Let's start figuring out how can we increase production, reduce costs, and increase profits. It was like, oh, okay, this is all, he was one of the things, this all works together. Let's see how we can do this. Now, the way he did it was to break a job down into small pieces. So he took someone's work and said, okay, what is one skill that this person needs to have? Then let's get another person has this skill, another person has this skill, another person has this skill, and then management's job is to coordinate all this. So he made things more efficient by figuring out how to get each skill to happen as quickly as possible. He's the one that brought in the stopwatches. So there's a lot of jokes about that, people coming with stopwatches, but he was trying to figure how fast can this job be done. There's a famous story. He created this fictitious character actually based on a real pig iron shoveler. In a steel mill, they shovel the pig iron, you know, with the big shovels. He made up this character named Schmidt. And his idea was, let's find the best pig iron shoveler, and then let's analyze him and see how he does it. What kind of shovel does he use? How many shovels per minute does he do? How often does he rest? And so forth. Now, what a lot of people don't understand about Frederick Taylor, and Marv Weisbord really, really nailed this for me, is that Taylor was trying to figure out a way to make life better for the people in the workplace. He found out, for instance, that the pig iron shoveler could actually shovel more pig iron if he was resting 57% of the time. Isn't that interesting? So he was actually trying to get a better quality of life for the people who were working. Taylor's the one who came up with the concept of matrix management, because when you have all these jobs going on, somebody has to manage across all those skills. He was very interested in labor management cooperation. In 1893, he came up with a business card. He was in his late 20s that said, consulting engineer, probably the first business card to ever have the word consultant on it. That was Frederick Taylor, the father of scientific management. Everybody after Taylor had to deal with Taylor because of what he had figured out about how to make organizations better. An expert comes in, analyzes the situation, and then breaks the job down into little pieces, creates time cards for people to work against certain standards, and then management's job is to make sure that all this stuff happens in the right way. It actually worked up to a point. And that point was discovered by Kurt Lewin. 1933, Hitler's Germany. He was a teacher at a university, and of course, being Jewish, his daughter was not allowed to go to school. He said, I will not teach in a university where my daughter cannot be a student. A couple years later, he emigrated, fled Germany, thank goodness for the world, actually, left Germany to come to America. He's the grandfather of the applied behavioral sciences. I'm going to spend more time on Lewin because I know more about him. I have a more direct connection with him, and because he's so significant for our field of OD. He had a great saying. He said, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. Now, theory comes from the Greek word theorein, which means to look at. It's a way of seeing. Kurt Lewin said, there's nothing as practical as a really great way of seeing what's happening. He came up with this idea called action research. He said there should be no action without research, no research without action. He brought the two together. Instead of just studying an organization and then submitting a report, Lewin figured out, let's get the people in the organization themselves to do the research. And he found out that increased their ownership. I mean, stuff we take for granted today. But he found out that when people actually participate in the data gathering, in the analysis, guess what? They own the data more. They're more excited about what the implications are and are much more likely to carry it out. During World War II in America, the government was trying to figure out how to get housewives. It was Margaret Mead, who was a good friend of Kurt Lewin's. Margaret Mead's the one who figured out that the housewives actually made the buying decisions and not the men. So this research project was aimed at housewives. They were trying to get housewives to buy basically spam, canned meat, so that the best cuts of meat could be given to the armed forces who were fighting the war. Well, housewives we're not going to use canned meat. We're going to use fresh meat. So Lewin and Margaret Mead and my mentor, Ron Lippitt, who was one of Levin's graduate students, they created this research project where they took one group of Iowa housewives and they gave them information about how the meat was needed for the war and what they ought to do. They gave them very clear reasons why they should stop using the best cuts of meat. They took a second group. They did this project a few times. They took a second group, gave them the same information, but then they had a discussion with the women where the women were invited to talk about all their resistance, all their reasons for not doing it, have a conversation about their thoughts and so forth. What happened is, after this happened, guess which group actually which group actually changed their buying habits? It was the group that had discussions about it. So here's one of the very first